Chapter 280. Of course, money was not a problem for Wilbur. All he cared about was comfort. He sat down in the living room of his suite and dialed Ted's number. The call connected and a voice could be heard answering the call. Hello? Mr. Dominic? Speaking. Who is this? Hi, I'm Wilbur Penn. I heard there was an auction happening tomorrow night. Could you help me with that? How did you get my number? Let's not get into that. We'll do this by the rules. As long as you know what the rules are. $100,000. No problem. When can we meet? Where are you? The Starry Hotel. 8 o'clock. By the pond in the hotel garden. Got it. The call ended, and Wilbur chuckled. What a guy. Demanding $100,000 upfront. That made Wilbur hopeful. He glanced at his watch. It was only a little over 5. So Wilbur rested a little before heading downstairs to eat. He arrived at the hotel garden at a little past 7. The garden was not big but made for a beautiful view with various trees and flowers. Wilbur strolled around on his own, making his way to the middle of the garden where a pond with a fountain was located. There were many chairs nearby for the guests to sit on, so Wilbur took a seat on one of them while he waited. Not long after that, a man wearing sunglasses and a floral shirt walked over and sat down on the seat by the pond. Wilbur waved at him. Mr. Dominic? The man looked over, then got up at once and walked up to Wilbur. Mr. Penn? Wilbur nodded. Ted got straight to the point. Follow the rules. I'll get you in there. No problem. Wilbur transferred the $100,000 at once. Ted put his phone away and took off his sunglasses. You're a man of your word, so I'll keep mine too. Be here again at 7 o'clock in the evening tomorrow. I'll take you there. Thank you so much. Wilbur smiled. Just then, a woman walked past them, catching both their attention. She was wearing sunglasses but had slender curves that her dress lugged around, radiating a charm that made Wilbur and Ted take another glance at her. Not bad, Ted chuckled. Wilbur, however, was a little surprised, wondering, isn't that Sammy Chandon? What is she doing over here? Sammy sat down in a more secluded spot, staring at the water in a daze. Ted and Wilbur exchanged smiles, and Wilbur was about to leave. Just then, a dozen men charged over and surrounded Sammy. A middle-aged man appeared from behind, shouting and cursing. You bitch! How fucking dare you? Was it really so fucking hard to just have dinner with me? Sammy's expression darkened and then turned her head to look away. Wilbur's eyes widened. That was Barry Lance. What a small world indeed. Barry stormed up to Sammy, his breath reeking of alcohol. Sammy Chandon, I only asked you out of courtesy. You're far from who you were 5 years ago. Sammy was fuming but remained silent. Barry sneered, turning to his men. Take her back. His men sprang into action, and Sammy's expression changed. She was, after all, a celebrity, and that was far too embarrassing. Wilbur could not take it any longer and shouted, What do you think you're doing, bullying a woman like that? Chapter 281. Wilbur stood in front of Sammy, blocking those men from harming her. Barry instantly sneered upon seeing that. He asked, Who the fuck are you? How dare you meddle in my business? Haven't you heard of the saying, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor? Wilbur asked nonchalantly. He did not want to meddle, but Barry had gone too far. Ignorance might be excusable if he did not know, but he would be wrong to stand by and watch it happen in front of him. Moreover, Sammy did a promotional concert for Cape Consortium. If she were to be involved in a scandal, the promotional efforts would turn into a joke. Barry laughed when he heard what Wilbur said. He pointed at him and said, All right, you're the first person who has the gall to meddle in my business in Toneville. Beat him up. Barry was extremely arrogant. He wanted to beat Wilbur into a pulp even though they were in public. Wilbur frowned. Suddenly, Ted jogged over and said politely, Mr. Lance, please calm down. We can talk this out. Barry glanced at Ted and asked coldly, Oh, it's you. Do you know him? I do know him, Ted nodded. Barry scoffed coldly and said, I'm sparing you for Ted's sake. Get lost right now and I won't trouble you. Ted instantly froze in place. He chuckled wryly after a moment, then whispered to Wilbur, He's the richest billionaire in Toneville. We can't afford to mess with him. Hurry up and apologize. We'll leave right after that. Why should I apologize? So what if he's a billionaire? Do you think I'm scared of him? Asked Wilbur nonchalantly. Ted anxiously said, Sir, you might not know this. He has a younger brother who is the tyrant in Toneville, the ruthless boss of a mafia. You'll die if you mess with him. I see. So, the younger brother is a mafia boss while the older brother is the richest man in Toneville. They basically ran Toneville then, joked Wilbur. Ted frowned and said, Of course. Hurry up and apologize. We really can't afford to mess with them. That won't be necessary. You should go. Don't forget about our arrangement for tomorrow night, said Wilbur. Ted wanted to persuade him further, but Barry was clearly annoyed at that point. He yelled, Beat him up. His subordinates lunged toward Wilbur. Ted had no choice but to stay far away. Wilbur was his client, but he could not afford to mess with Barry. Helping out his client was one thing, but he would not want to get beaten up for his client. His life might be in danger. This guy is so stubborn. He deserves it. Ted sighed and felt sorry for Wilbur. Barry's subordinates tried to brutally attack Wilbur. Wilbur smiled and defeated them in the blink of an eye. The men were whining in pain on the ground, and they all looked bruised. Ted was stunned, and Barry was in complete disbelief. Sammy also seemed slacked. She removed her sunglasses and looked at Wilbur. Wilbur approached Barry and stood in front of him, then patted his shoulder and said, Mr. Lance, you better not cross the line. I paid her a lot of money for the concert, but she's being a stuck-up bitch. Isn't that a bit unreasonable of her? Barry was shocked, but he was not a cowardly man, so he showed no fear. Wilbur nodded and said, I understand, but she's not consenting to it, so don't force it. Why do you have to make it so difficult for everyone? I'm Barry Lance, and I've never been mistreated like this. You know how to fight. But it doesn't mean anything. There are tons of people who can defeat you, said Barry. Wilbur laughed and shook his head, saying, I know there are people more powerful than me, but you clearly aren't. You won't take her away as long as I'm here today. Suddenly, a woman who brought along two men rushed toward them. The woman hurriedly approached Sammy and told her, Sammy, why did you leave during the meal? You've angered Mr. Lance. I'm here to sing, not to escort him, Sammy retorted angrily. Chapter 282. The woman sighed and said, Sammy, you're not the same as 5 years ago. He spent a lot of money to hire you, but you won't show him any respect. I'm having a hard time as your agent. Miss Lawson, I don't feel so well today. Can we forget about it tonight? Sammy asked with a frown. Miss Lawson sighed and walked toward Barry. She smiled apologetically and said, Mr. Lance, Sammy isn't feeling well. We should cancel the dinner party tonight. She has a concert performance tomorrow night. How about having her accompany you after she's rested? Barry ignored her and looked at Wilbur, warning him, I'll remember you. We'll meet again very soon. After that, he turned and left. Miss Lawson and her assistants hurriedly followed behind Barry and apologized. Noticing that their boss had left, Barry's subordinates quickly scrambled to their feet and fled the scene. They were the only ones who knew how hard Wilbur had hit them. Wilbur stood in front of Sammy and asked, Are you all right? Stay away from me, Sammy said with a frown. Wilbur was stunned. He could not believe that she was mad at him for helping her. Sammy looked at Wilbur and said coldly, I know what you're thinking about. You men are all the same. You think that I'll be grateful and have a crush on you just because you can fight and you help me, right? I've seen enough men like you before. Wilbur was speechless. How can someone like this exist? He shook his head and left. He did not want to stay since she was giving him the cold shoulder. Ted chased after him and said, Mr. Penn, our agreement has to be cancelled. What do you mean? Asked Wilbur coldly. Ted sighed and said, You just provoked Barry Lance. You should know that his younger brother is Xavier Lance, and he's in the mafia. People died because of him. I do like making money, but I prefer being alive. Wilbur turned cold and said, You accepted my money. I can give you a refund, Ted replied. Wilbur sneered coldly and said, That won't be necessary. If I don't see you at our agreed time tomorrow night, You won't ever work in Toneville again." Ted was intimidated by Wilbur and froze in place. Sammy stood up and slowly walked past Wilbur. Her swaying figure revealed a necklace that she wore. Wilbur had a look and he instantly frowned. He hurriedly called out after her, "Wait." Sammy turned around and looked at Wilbur with a cold gaze. She asked in an unfriendly tone, "What do you want?" "Your necklace," he said. Sammy hurriedly covered her chest. She blushed and said, "I knew you men are perverts. What are you looking at?" "At your necklace." "There's a huge problem with your necklace," he said while frowning. Sammy sneered and said, "Please find a better way to strike up a conversation. This necklace has been blessed by a monk and is worth $500,000. Do you really think there's a problem with it?" Wilbur shrugged and said, "Well, you're really unlucky then. You're going to spend your whole life in bad luck by wearing that necklace." "Bullshit," she cursed. He sighed and said, "It's fine if you don't believe me. I've said my piece. But I'd advise you to get rid of that necklace as soon as possible." Then, Wilbur turned and walked away, leaving Sammy to stand there in a daze. Ted looked frantic. He frowned and left in a hurry. Sammy was dumbfounded for some time. She watched Wilbur leave and scoffed coldly. She said, "He's just trying to act all mysterious. I know what he's up to." Chapter 283. Sammy left feeling frustrated. She went back to her penthouse suite and lay on the bed. She felt like she was in turmoil. She had been down on her luck for the past few years. Her records flopped, and her popularity kept plummeting. The fee for her appearance were getting lower and lower, to the point where she could barely make ends meet. The situation had left her anxious and depressed. Does it really have anything to do with the necklace, though? She wondered. She removed the necklace. It was a platinum necklace with a red ruby pendant. She remembered when she was at the peak of popularity. Her best friend, who was also a singer, spent a lot of money on the necklace during a trip to Rilland. She also hired a monk to bless the necklace for luck and prosperity. "My best friend is so nice to me. How can my falling career possibly have anything to do with this necklace?" She thought about it, then put on the necklace again. It was a symbol of their friendship, so she could not throw it away. That guy's just making up nonsense. She crawled onto the bed, but she could not fall asleep. Her mind kept replaying the scene of Barry's harassment and her falling career. It frustrated her greatly. Meanwhile, Wilbur was also on his bed. He thought about the necklace Sammy wore, and he could not help but shake his head. He knew something was wrong the moment he laid eyes on it. He inspected it with his spirit energy and discovered a curse inside. Then, he looked at Sammy. She looked great because she was wearing makeup. However, her gaze was unenergetic. Her spirit energy was all over the place, which meant she was affected by the curse. He wondered why her enemy would do something so horrible to her. However, Wilbur decided to stay out of it because of her attitude. He felt like he should focus on the auction. He was hoping to discover something tomorrow night. Meanwhile, Ted had been waiting outside Barry's suite after he left. Barry walked out looking drunk. Ted quickly approached and greeted him. Barry glanced at him and asked, "What is it?" "Hi, Mr. Lance. I'm here to tell you that guy had nothing to do with me. Someone introduced him to me because he wanted to attend tomorrow night's auction. We really just met," explained Ted. Barry laughed. He patted Ted on the shoulder and said, "You're a smart one. My brother is still on his way back from out of town, and he's heading toward Toneville right now. In that case, we'll deal with him tomorrow night. And then I'll take care of that woman, Sammy Chandon. I'll show them who's in charge in Toneville." "Yes, of course. You and your brother run Toneville after all," said Ted while laughing along. Harry laughed and said, "You know how things are. Keep an eye on him and report his location to me at all times. Make sure he doesn't escape." "I understand, Mr. Lance," said Ted while nodding and bowing. Barry laughed and headed toward the room. He yelled, "Get 2 ladies in here right now. I'm super pissed off." His subordinates immediately went off to make arrangements. Ted wiped the sweat off his forehead. The Lenz brothers were the tyrants in Toneville. The place was fully under their control, other than Saul Mendes, who was living discreetly on his own. Ted felt like Wilbur was unfortunate to have messed with the brothers. "I'm sorry, buddy, but I can't afford to mess with these two," muttered Ted to himself, He sighed and left. The next evening, Wilbur arrived at the garden as agreed upon. Ted had been waiting for him for a long time. Wilbur smiled and said, "You're quite punctual." "That's because I accepted your money," laughed Ted. "Are you not afraid of Barry?" Ted shrugged and said, "I still am. But you can fight. I'm more scared of you." "Huh? Can we go now?" asked Wilbur nonchalantly. Ted looked at his watch and said, "We can. It's at the rooftop banquet hall." Wilbur was taken aback. He asked slowly, "It's right here. And you dared to charge me $100,000 for this?" "Buddy, you can't get in without me no matter how close you are," replied Ted. Wilbur smiled and said, "That's true. Let's go." Chapter 284. They walked to the hotel and took the elevator to the rooftop. The rooftop was a banquet hall. Men in black suits stood at the entrance of the elevator lobby. They filled the entire corridor and gave off a daunting presence. It was clearly closed off to the public. They were stopped by those men as soon as they stepped out of the elevator. Ted stepped forward and said, "He's with me, and he's the boss. I vouch for him." Ted seemed to be a regular there who was very familiar with the place. The leader of the bodyguards glanced at Wilbur, nodded, then allowed him to enter. Wilbur looked at the never-ending line of men in black suits as he walked. He said, "You have quite the reputation here. I've been messing around in Toneville since I was a kid. Everyone here shows me some respect." Wilbur nodded. People like Ted may not be of high status, but he was well connected. When people needed something, they would seek help from someone like him. He was the kind of person who could navigate social circles with ease, a jack of all trades. Wilbur noticed that many people were seated inside upon arriving at the banquet hall. There were also hundreds of men in black suits standing around, openly carrying swords on their backs. Ted led Wilbur to their seats. Wilbur said, "The owner of this place knows how to plan an auction." "That's right. This auction would have ended a long time ago if he didn't." Wilbur smiled and waited in silence. 30 minutes later, all the guests finally arrived. The door of the banquet hall was closed, and so began the auction. 4 items were auctioned away without garnering Wilbur's interest. Although the items were nice, they did not meet his expectations. The 5th piece was then presented for auction. It was a bronze sword. The sword was a first-class cultural relic that was expressly prohibited by the state from being sold or taken out of the country. Those who were knowledgeable could tell that it probably came from an ancient tomb, and it was a very valuable item. Wilbur inspected it and immediately decided he wanted it. The sword contained a certain power, which was good enough as a sacrifice. Wilbur had a smile on his face as he made the first bid for $30 million. Someone raised the bid, but Wilbur did not get riled up, slowly raising his bid. Some bidders quit, but there were 2 bidders who kept bidding against Wilbur. They would not relent. They were determined to get the sword. Wilbur stayed calm and slowly raised his bid. The bronze sword was up to $140 million because of their contest. The onlookers were quite surprised by that point. The auctioned item was nice, but it was from an unknown source. It was not a worthwhile bid. However, Wilbur did not care about that. He raised the bid up to $200 million. The 2 competing bidders finally gave up, and the auctioneer declared Wilbur the owner of the bronze sword. The crowd applauded and Wilbur chuckled. He transferred the money without any hesitation. Just as he was about to take the bronze sword, a buff, bald man slowly emerged from behind a folding screen. He looked at Wilbur with a sinister smile and said, "You're not taking this piece with you." "What do you mean?" asked Wilbur coldly. Someone from the crowd exclaimed that it was Mr. Lance. "I can't believe Mr. Lance showed up personally. It seems like trouble from the looks of it, right?" "Definitely. This guy is in huge trouble." The crowd started to gossip. The man who was known as Mr. Lance rubbed his bald head and asked Wilbur, "Did you beat up my brother's man?" "I've beaten up a lot of people before." "Who is your brother?" asked Wilbur coldly. Mr. Lance laughed. He looked at the hundreds of people in the room and said, "I never expected to meet someone who doesn't know me and my brother in Toneville." Chapter 285. Wilbur chuckled upon hearing that and asked, "Who the hell are you? Do I need to know you?" His words instantly caused an uproar among the crowd. The Lance brothers were well known. Xavier Lance had been in the mafia since he was a kid. and he was famous for being ruthless. He had encountered an expert who taught him how to fight when he was a teenager, and he became exceptionally skilled in combat. He ruled over Toneville from then on, and no one dared to cross him. The older brother, Barry Lance, was clever and used his younger brother's reputation on the streets as a stepping stone to enter the business world. He went through it all, and he eventually built the Lance financial empire. The Lance brothers had been running Toneville ever since Saul Mendes announced his retirement and lived in seclusion. Any businessman in Toneville had to bow down to the brothers, no matter how successful they were. They could not believe this young man standing in front of them disrespected the Lance brothers while in Toneville. He was getting into a load of trouble. They all looked at Wilbur and shook their heads. They knew he was doomed. Suddenly, Xavier sneered coldly and said, "You dare to talk back, huh? You'll soon find out who the Lance brothers are. Brother, come on out." Barry slowly emerged from behind the folding screen when Xavier shouted. Sammy followed from behind, and she was clearly restrained by two men. "Now do you know who my brother is?" asked Xavier coldly. Wilbur laughed in realization. He said, "Oh, it's him. The guy who picks on women. I thought he was some kind of hero." The joke instantly made Barry furious. He glared at Wilbur and said, "Your death is near, but you're still so flippant. Let's see how long you can keep that attitude. Are you canceling the concert?" Wilbur did not reply to Barry, asking Sammy instead. Sammy had tears in her eyes, appearing extremely aggrieved. It was at that moment that she knew how scary Toneville was because of the tyrants. They did whatever they pleased because they were above the rules. She had to watch Barry beat her agent and two assistants to the ground until they were unconscious. She was forced to be there. Barry also threatened her, saying that he wanted her to watch him handle Wilbur, after which he would play with her like a toy. She would be buried alive if he was not satisfied with her service. She was terrified, so she could only obey and follow him. She felt more resentful toward Wilbur at the same time. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't have ended up here. Sammy did not answer him. Barry burst out laughing and said, "Did you really think I invited her here for a concert? I just wanted to play with her. I might have been more civilized before you stepped in, but I won't hold back now since you hit my man for this woman. I'll deal with you tonight. Then I'll take care of her slowly." The brothers were arrogant and unreasonable. There were hundreds of people in the crowd, but no one dared to speak up. Wilbur chuckled and glanced at them. He said slowly, "In that case, have you made plans for the money I just transferred?" "Consider that as our compensation," laughed Xavier. Wilbur finally understood why there were two bidders that would not quit. The Lance brothers set him up. Wilbur looked at Ted and asked, "Ted Dominic, I assume you're in on this too?" Ted stood up and walked towards Barry. He stood next to Barry and said in an arrogant tone, "I'm sorry, but you messed with Mr. Lance. Don't blame me for this." "Nice one." Wilbur laughed at his reply, and he started to clap. The crowd thought Wilbur was crazy. How could he laugh at a time like this? Chapter 286. Xavier was enraged by Wilbur's reply and ordered his goons, "Kill him." Hundreds of men in black suits surrounded Wilbur with their swords drawn. It looked like they were going to cut Wilbur into pieces. Sammy instantly turned pale, and her legs turned weak. The crowd did not dare to watch any further and turned to look away. Suddenly, someone yelled at the door, "Saul Mendes has arrived." Everyone was shocked to hear that. They all stood up to watch. Xavier also hurriedly stopped his subordinates and rushed toward the door. A slim, elderly man in a white outfit slowly walked in with a young man. Xavier bowed and smiled along. He asked, "Mr. Mendes, why did you come without informing me? I would have picked you up." The elderly man known as Mr. Mendes waved it off and said, "There's no need for that. I heard something incredible came up in this auction, so I came to have a look." "What are you interested in?" "I'll just send it to your house." Xavier walked toward the stage while accompanying Saul. Everyone stood up at that point and bowed at Saul to show their utmost respect. Only Wilbur stood there without doing anything. Saul came up on the stage and glanced at Wilbur. Then he turned his attention to the bronze sword. He observed it for a while, then picked up the bronze sword with both hands to channel some spiritual energy into it. The bronze sword instantly emitted a blue radiance that was somehow overpowering. Everyone was shocked by it. "All right." Saul looked overjoyed. He kept saying, "This is it. I want it." "Sure, of course. I'll have someone send it to your house immediately. Don't you worry," said Xavier with a smile. Barry added, "It is our honor that you're interested in one of our auction items, Mr. Mendes." Saul laughed and said, "You two have always been nice. Keep up the good work." "Yes, of course. We run things smoothly because of you, sir," said Barry while laughing. Suddenly, Wilbur asked coldly, "I won the bid for this item. Did you ask for my permission before taking it away?" Saul frowned and looked at Wilbur. Xavier hurriedly said, "Mr. Mendes, that's not true. We have a grudge to resolve. And we're in the middle of that. He's just talking nonsense." Saul thought about it and said, "In that case, hurry up and resolve it, or else I'll be a laughingstock when I take the sword back." Then, Saul walked away from the stage and found a seat. He started to take a nap. Xavier looked at Wilbur and said coldly, "Saul Mendes is here, so I don't want to spill blood. You better kneel and apologize to my brother. We'll take the $200 million as compensation and forget this ever happened." "Forget this?" Wilbur laughed and asked, "Did you ask me if I'm planning on letting this go?" "They accepted my money and wanted to forget about it." What a joke, Wilbur thought. "You're just asking for trouble." Barry choked Sammy by the neck and pulled her close to him. He groped her and smiled sinisterly. "Since you refuse our mercy, I'll show you something nice. You like to play the hero, right? I'll let you be the hero and try to save her today." Barry started to mentally torment and insult Wilbur since he would not give in. Barry intended to enjoy it for a while before killing Wilbur. He wanted to see if Wilbur would keep up his act. Sammy was being harassed in public, so she instantly exclaimed, "Why won't you apologize? Do you want to die? Don't drag me to hell with you." At that moment, Xavier, who was too confident with his skill, tried to do a sneak attack at Wilbur and resolve the issue right away. "Arg!" Xavier was instantly sent flying away. He kept coughing up blood before he hit the wall behind him and cracked it from the impact. His body then slowly slid to the floor. Wilbur scoffed coldly and stood with hands behind his back. He looked coldly at Xavier, who was unconscious on the floor. Everyone exclaimed and looked at Wilbur in disbelief. It was as if they saw a ghost. Some people stood up because they were shocked. Ted blacked out because of fear. Barry could not believe that Wilbur injured his brother with one punch. He was shocked. Feeling a sense of dread crept into his heart. He unconsciously let go of the hand that was choking Sammy. Sammy covered her mouth in shock. She looked at Wilbur in disbelief. "I don't believe this. Is this even humanly possible?" Saul suddenly opened his eyes and looked at Wilbur in surprise. He seemed shocked and lost in his own thoughts. Xavier finally caught his breath after a moment. He struggled to get up as he sought help from Saul. "Save me, Mr. Mendes." He finally understood why Wilbur was unafraid and had the courage to disrespect them. He could not believe that Wilbur was such a powerful cultivator. He possessed the power of lightning. He would be dead if he was not quick enough to notice it. He defended himself from the punch just in time. However, he did not know that Wilbur had no intention of killing him, otherwise he would have been blown to bits. Saul stood up and slowly walked toward Wilbur. Everyone started to whisper and talk when they saw that. Saul was well known to be mysterious and powerful. They knew he was far stronger than Xavier. The Lenz brothers ruled over Toneville because Saul had retired. Moreover, the Lenz brothers constantly provided for Saul. It was why they were able to be tyrants in Toneville. If Saul were to fight, then neither of them could end up as the winner. Xavier noticed that Saul was about to fight, so he struggled to walk toward him. He glared at Wilbur and threatened, "I can't handle you. But Mr. Mendes can. You better watch it. Toneville is not a place where outsiders like you can cause trouble." Everyone thought Saul was going to attack. However, Saul saluted and bowed at Wilbur. He asked, "Excuse me, may I know what's your relationship with Master Penn of Seachertown?" "Master Penn?" asked Wilbur in a puzzling tone. Saul hurriedly said, "The Master Penn who defeated Jeremy Owens with lightning power." Wilbur burst out laughing. "When did I have a nickname like Master Penn?" he wondered. He assumed that Saul attended the event back then but failed to recognize him due to his transformed appearance. Wilbur laughed and said, "I'm his brother. How can I help you, Mr. Mendes?" "Please, just call me Saul." Saul bowed politely. He was very respectful. Wilbur smiled gently and said, "Saul, it looks like you guys have quite the power in Toneville." "Oh no," Saul was immediately sweating bullets. He hurriedly said, "I've been retired for many years. The Lens brothers have been up to no good. I'll teach them a lesson right away." Chapter 289. "Oh, really? Don't you have any responsibility in this matter?" asked Wilbur coldly. Saul wiped the sweat on his forehead. He was horrified inside, and he did not know how to answer that question. He witnessed the fight between Master Penn's brother and Jeremy Owens. Jeremy was like a terrifying demon that almost wiped them out. Master Penn single-handedly turned the situation around like he was the god of thunder himself. He defeated Jeremy, and his power could only be described as terrifying. Everyone called him by his nickname from then on, Master Penn. He could not believe Master Penn's brother was in Toneville. Saul had no idea how he was to resolve the incident. Saul clenched his jaw after some thought. He yelled at Xavier and Barry, "You two, get over here right now." The two brothers looked puzzled and horrified. However, an order from Saul was like an inviolable edict. They did not dare to disobey him. They approached Saul anxiously while they looked at Wilbur with absolute dread. Everyone was dumbfounded. They thought Saul was about to attack. They did not expect Saul to give in after a brief conversation. Saul was being respectful as though he was afraid of Wilbur. That scene was something they found hard to believe. Suddenly, Saul punched Xavier in the stomach and also kicked Barry in the chest at the same time. Xavier let out a miserable cry, and his body was once again sent flying, crashing heavily onto the ground. He stopped moving after that. Barry spat out a mouthful of blood as he was sent flying too. He flew several meters away as he knocked over tables and chairs before hitting the ground. He did not stop coughing up blood. That made everyone gasp involuntarily in shock. Saul looked at everyone and announced coldly, "The Lens brothers have committed numerous crimes, and I will eliminate them today for the greater good. Putting an end to both of them will also serve as a settlement to Mr. Penn." Everyone looked horrified but was overjoyed deep down inside. The Lens brothers ruled over Toneville, and they suffered under their rule. With the brothers dead, they were free to move on without having to be under their control anymore. From the looks of it, even if they did not die today, they were pretty much finished. It seemed that Toneville would finally enjoy some peace. Saul turned to Wilbur after he said that. He bowed respectfully again and said, "Sir, I'm also responsible for the brothers' actions. Please punish me as you see fit." Wilbur said coldly, "Of course you're responsible. You accepted their offerings and allowed them to rule over Toneville. Did you think I'm blind?" "Yes, of course. I was wrong. I'll change my ways. Please punish me as you see fit, sir. I can accept any form of punishment," said Saul with a lowered head. Wilbur glanced at the Lens brothers. He realized that Xavier had died. It was not a surprise because he was badly injured before taking the punch from Saul. Barry was alive, but he was badly injured, lying there as he struggled to breathe. Wilbur scoffed coldly and said, "Xavier is dead, and Barry is badly injured. They've learned their lesson, so I'll let this go. As for you, I'm going to give you another chance. I'll hold you responsible if anyone dares to be tyrants in Toneville again. Of course, from now on, I'm making a new rule to follow your orders, sir. I'll lead by example." Saul agreed without hesitation. Wilbur took the bronze sword and walked toward Sammy. He said in a nonchalant tone, "You're free to go." Sammy covered her mouth as she looked at Wilbur. There was admiration in her eyes, and she was so emotional that she could not speak. Wilbur shook his head and left. However, Saul stepped forward and said, "Sir, please wait." "Anything else?" asked Wilbur. Saul bowed and replied, "The Lens brothers dared to scam you, so I'll have them return your money, and they'll be punished for it." Then, Saul took out a card and handed it to Wilbur with both hands. He said, "There are $500 million in here. The $200 million are yours, and the $300 million is considered their punishment. It's not appropriate for you to pay the price, said Wilbur. Saul hurriedly added, don't worry. Barry Lentz is still alive, so he'll be paying for it. Think of it as payment for his life. Thank you, then. Wilbur accepted the card. Saul hurriedly told him the PIN number. After that, Wilbur walked away in style. Sammy snapped out of it and hurriedly chased after Wilbur. Wilbur got into his car and drove away quickly. Not only did he obtain a sacrifice during the trip, but he also made a profit of $300 million. He would have to admit that it was an abundant harvest.